Welcome everyone tonight to our author talk with Brett Palfreyman. We're very excited to have him here today to talk about bringing oysters back to the New York Harbor. Before we get into his talk, I just wanted to make a few announcements about Historic Red Hook. We always have several upcoming events on the docket, and we'd love to see some of you there. We have coming up in April our Member Appreciation Night. So that'll be coming up in, I don't have the date on me right now, but if you're a member, you should have received a save the date in your email. And if you're not a member but are interested in learning more, you can always visit our website to find out how to become a member. We'd love to have you. We'll be doing a small author's presentation at that member appreciation night from Peter Esserson, who is one of our board members. He'll be talking to us about his newest book, which is being released in April, all about farming in the Hudson Valley. And it is, as he is a photographer, it's got beautiful photos. So it's going to be a very great event to see that. So that's our upcoming member appreciation night. And then we have in June, our big event of the season is going to be our Then and Now Festival. This is the second time we've done this festival, and this year we'll be focusing on farms, family, and food in Red Hook. So it's going to be, a large event in the Elmendorf Inn as well as on the green with displays and farmers. So if you'd like to learn more about that, visit our website. Okay, I'm just going through and making sure everybody's muted. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. We have Dr. Palfreyman with us tonight. He is a graduate of the Red Hook Central School System, and he is also an associate professor at Wagner College, where he teaches in the history department. His own work focuses on loyalists in the Revolution, and he, as he was just telling me before this, he has taken an environmental history turn, and that's where he got interested in this history of oysters. So he's going to be speaking primarily on that tonight. So I'm going to turn this over to Brett. If you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and put those in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end when we do Q&A. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to you, Brett.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and good evening, everybody. It's a real honor to be invited to speak back in my own hometown, or at least virtually. But first, I want to thank Dylan Streifenator for reaching out to me and making this happen. I also want to thank some of the local folks who helped inspire me to become a historian, the people teaching history and social studies at Red Hook schools, especially Mr. Sutton, Mr. Kaiser, Mrs. Greenblatt, Mr. Decker, Mr. Dombrowski, and many more. And Mr. Pavlich, even though you teach chemistry, I'll give you a shout out here too. I see you're here. I want to thank you all for putting me on this path, and go Raiders forever. Now on to business for tonight. I'm sure most of you would recognize Lower Manhattan today. It is a very busy and a very dense place. Can you see my mouse, Elizabeth? Elizabeth? Cool. All right, cool. So we got the World Trade Center, Wall Street's over here, Battery Park down at the very bottom. That's the spot where you find the ferry to get out to the Statue of Liberty. And I know it well because I spent most of the last decade living in this building right here. I love it. I miss it. Just moved out. And tonight, I want us all to try a little of what I'm going to call imaginative archaeology. I want you to try to look at this place and then in your mind peel back 400 years of history and try to imagine what this place might have looked like all the way back in 1609 when English explorer Henry Hudson first sailed into New York Harbor and encountered Lenape peoples, who of course had already been here for centuries. Now I know imagining Manhattan 400 years ago is a bit of a leap. Manhattan itself is probably the most built up, the most built over, and the most developed piece of land in the entire Western Hemisphere. So it's hard for us to imagine today how it might be a natural place, or how it could have been a natural place at one point in the history. But think about it for a second. Can you picture it? Luckily, we don't have to work too hard because a helpful ecologist, a guy by the name of Eric Sanderson, used some very old and very detailed maps and some modern CGI technologies to make uh, renderings of what Manhattan might have looked like in 1609. And this is his best guess. It might have looked something like this. Um, it looks to me like a pretty spectacular natural place. In fact, Sanderson thinks had New York Harbor not become the biggest and most important city in America, um, it was such a tremendous natural wonder that it might have become one of our greatest national parks. Imagine like a Yellowstone or a Yosemite of the East Coast could have been our very own New York Harbor had it not become a major city. Um, if you're interested in how Eric Sanderson, the ecologist, came to this, created this map, it's in a book called Mannahatta, which is excellent. I recommend it. Um, but we know that New York Harbor is so special because it is an estuary. It's a place where fresh water coming down from the Hudson River and in from the Passaic River in New Jersey meets salt water coming in from the Atlantic Ocean. And this creates these beautiful, marshy wetlands that are, in fact, brackish, where salt water and fresh water are mixed together. Um, we don't have to imagine what they look like. They still exist in some places. This is the Meadowlands in New Jersey, which looks a lot like what New York Harbor might have looked like back in 1609. Um, I'm an Eagles fan, so I know this place as Giant Stadium, the place where the Eagles go and win all the time. Um, but back in 1609, these marshy wetlands would have been everywhere. In fact, on this map, they're marked out in green. So all along the New Jersey coastline, around Staten Island, around northern New Jersey shore, Jamaica Bay, in modern day Brooklyn and Queens, up around the Long Island Sound, all of these areas marked out in green would have been these marshy, brackish wetlands. Um, and for our purposes tonight, these kinds of brackish wetlands are important because they make excellent habitat, of course, for oysters. Some scholars think that back in 1609, when Henry Hudson first arrived, New York Harbor was probably the single greatest oyster habitat in the entire planet. Um, we guess that there might have been something like 220,000 acres of oyster beds here. By some estimates, that means maybe half of the oyster population of the entire world was in New York Harbor at that moment. Tremendous place for oysters to live and grow. So, obviously, with this tremendous natural resource available, we can imagine that oysters are going to become a staple food, an important part of the lives of any humans who happen to live here. So, from the very beginning, oysters were hugely important to the Lenape peoples, the very first inhabitants of this area. This painting or watercolor that I have here is actually from Virginia, but it gives us an idea of how indigenous peoples might have harvested oysters, um, probably like using kind of rake-like tool, like this person is here. Um, how do we know this? How do we know that this is happening? Well, we know because archaeologists, whenever they dig pretty much anywhere around the shorelines in modern day New York City, are constantly finding the leftovers of people who were collected and harvested and eaten oysters. In fact, we call them middens, which were basically like garbage heaps of the Lenape peoples left behind, full of oyster shells. And I went through these old collections of photographs from archaeology sites, and they're always finding oyster shells every time they're digging. Those seem to be the two constants of 19th century archaeology is one, they're finding oyster shells, and two, they all have just amazing mustaches. Um, I've gone into the city's archaeological collections, and found and seen some of these actual shells that were dug up in and around New York City. And let me tell you, they don't look like the oyster shells that you get at the raw bar at a restaurant, your silver dollar oysters. These things are monsters. This is one that a colleague of mine found um, that was almost 12 inches long, like bigger than his whole hands. And you can imagine the size of the oysters that might have come out of something like this. Pretty impressive. Um, Once the Dutch, and then later the English, and then later the Americans took control over New York City, oysters grew to become an entire industry. They were first harvested relatively small scale by hand, like we see in this painting from the Staten Island Historical Society. And they've used tools. I mean, I haven't seen one of these in real life, but I imagine it looks kind of like a post hole digger with a kind of a big hinged set of tongs where you go down and you scoop up and you come up with oysters. Um, but as time passed, harvesting methods got more efficient. So soon after, we get dredging by sail and then dredging by steam. And oysters really become an industry. They become big business, especially in places like uh, Lemon Creek, which is in the southeastern corner of Staten Island. If you know Staten Island, it's between Annandale and Tottenville, down here. And we can see some of the evidence from the industry in, for example, this old postcard from around 1900. This is a marina in Lemon Creek full of all of the, harvesting ships and infrastructure. Uh, Oysters created jobs for people who would do processing, cleaning, sorting, preparing for market, mostly women and children doing that kind of work in this image here. It also provided work for, particularly in Staten Island, freed African Americans, especially those who were coming up from the South to a place called Sandy Ground, one of the first and longest lasting free Black communities in Staten Island, Sandy Ground. And these were escaped slaves or freedmen who came north from Virginia and Maryland, having experience working with oystering in the Chesapeake, and set up this whole industry in places like Sandy Ground on Staten Island. So that's the supply side. What about demand? Who's eating all of these oysters that are being produced by the industry? The short answer is everybody is eating oysters. Oysters were kind of like the signature food of New York City before hot dogs, before thin crust pizza. The thing that you would get served in New York would be oysters. And we're going to see it all across the scale of class ranges. So here, for example, you can see people eating oysters in kind of the fanciest of restaurants where the servers are, it looks like a raw bar in a modern kind of fancy restaurant. You can see it in the actual menus that they left over. Here's a dinner menu actually collected in a large collection of menus at the New York Public Library, which is pretty awesome. This will be the Metropolitan Hotel. And here is their menu for Tuesday, August 22nd, 1893. And if you started off, you would have had fish, soups, shellfish, all different kinds of options. And I actually went through and I counted all of the oyster options, and there ends up being 16 on this menu. Oysters on the shell, the half shell, stewed, box stewed, steamed, fried, broiled, roast and shell, pan roast, oyster fritters, oysters au gratin, pickled oysters, oysters a la poulet, saddle rocks raw, saddle rock stewed, and of course, oyster pate. Lots of choices. And at a quarter each, maybe, the prices sounds pretty right in 1893. Um, I can't help but read this menu and think of Forrest and Bubba talking about shrimp. Like that's how important oysters was, as important as shrimp to Forrest and Bubba. That's the high end, right? That's the the fancy restaurants, the people who are printing menus and leaving them to the New York Public Library. For everybody else, oysters would have been available as a street food, which is kind of cool. We know this because an Italian watercolorist by the name of Nicolino Callio came to New York City in the early 1800s and painted all of these scenes from the street of kind of the characters that you might meet walking down a New York City street in 1825 or thereabouts. And of course, he included the oyster stand. And here, with all the fixings, I wonder if they have the same stuff back in the day. But here's where you get oysters on the street in the cart. If you don't want to go to the cart will come to you. This is the Instacart or the Peapod of the 18th century, where the oyster man will blow his horn and you come right up to your house. And if you don't believe the watercolors, here's a later photograph, a street cart, oysters and clams, 1 cent each. Yeah, so don't go to the Metropolitan Hotel, just go to the street, much better. Um, so New Yorkers are eating oysters at such rates that they start creating piles like this. I mean, it's hard not to notice in old photographs of restaurants and kind of restaurant neighborhoods in the city. Piles like this under I think that's the Manhattan Bridge, probably recently completed. Um, from the side view, you can see the piles adding up there and all of these little oyster house restaurants along the harbor. I guess this guy, I don't know if he had too much oysters or too much, wine or beer, but he had a rough evening there, clearly. Um, or even piles like this. This was the winner, like truly mountains of oyster shells, just being processed by this industry and consumed by New Yorkers. Um, now comes the sadder part of the story. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the city was growing so fast that not even this native oyster population could keep up. Overfishing, pollution, and also dredging, all of the work to make the rivers wider for commercial shipping, all of these combined to help push the oyster population to the brink. And I'll give you a few examples here. Here's one of the more interesting uh, historical maps that I've come across. As you can see, this is a map of New York Harbor again. Manhattan's here, Staten Island, the entrance to the harbor. Here's a close-up of the title of the map. It's called Outline Map of New York Harbor and Vicinity, showing tidal flow, sewer outlets, and shellfish beds, made by the New York Bay Pollution Commission in 1905. Now, why would they be keeping track of tidal flow, sewer outlets, and shellfish beds? Well, the answer is not good. If we look a little closely, you can see each of these numbers is a sewer outlet, a pipe dumping sewage into the river. And where does the river flow and the tide carry all of the sewage coming out of the dense parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn, Queens? Well, of course, carries it right by all of these oyster beds. Like here on the edge of Staten Island, Lemon Creek is right about here, that spot that we looked at earlier. And right through the shellfish beds, the sewage of the entire city is being trickled, filtered through. So that puts some strain on the oyster population. We also get industrial pollution. Here's an old photo of Newtown Creek, which is between Brooklyn and Queens and empties out into the East River, all of which also would be carried through the shellfish beds. And then, of course, there's our old trash disposal system, which was load the trash on a barge, drive it a couple miles out, and dump it into the Atlantic Ocean, or hopefully the Atlantic Ocean. Hopefully they made it that far. I'm just noticing now, looking closely at this, that they didn't even have like a mechanical dump, like a dump truck or like a mechanical shovel. These guys are out there by hand shoveling the barge off into the ocean. The end of all of this overfishing, pollution, and, you know, dredging for commercial shipping is that by 1927, the city declares oysters from New York Harbor unsafe to eat. And they've been not entirely, but pretty much functionally extinct ever since then. But that's not the end of the story, of course. I can't leave you hanging there. There is some optimism. So just in the last decade or so, there's been a committed and sustained effort to bring oysters back to New York Harbor. There are several different kinds of organizations and nonprofits and schools involved. But the most famous of these is called the Billion Oyster Project, which has been getting a lot of press recently. You may have heard of it. And their goal is to seed 1 billion oysters into New York waters by 2030. Now, I'm teaching environmental history in New York City, and I heard about these kinds of organizations. And some students and I decided that we want to be a part of this process. So we decided to run a little experiment. Here's what we did. We wanted to know, this research team of maybe a dozen undergraduates and myself, we wanted to know, will oysters still grow, and how well will they grow in New York Harbor, in New York waters? Where do we start? Well, first, we thought, why not Lemon Creek? You know, that place that had been the old heart of the oystering industry on Staten Island, and a relatively easy 20-minute drive from Wagner College where I teach. So we picked we picked Lemon Creek, and here's a satellite view of what the area looks like. I'll give you the basic idea. So Lemon Creek is an actual creek, and it comes in on the beaches of Staten Island, past a little lagoon here. Like this is like a pond, a kind of a fresh saltwater pond that goes up and down with the tides. There is a marina, a operating, working marina at the very mouth of the creek. And then a big area of marshy wetlands. The Highland Boulevard Bridge runs right through, and then further marshy wetlands up above, upstream of the bridge, with residential neighborhoods all around. Here's what it looks like at the beach, the mouth of Lemon Creek, which is looking out into Prince's Bay, the outer harbor of New York City, and ultimately the Atlantic Ocean. Here's what the marina looks like. Modern day looking marina. In fact, that's us passing through on our kayaks and our paddle boards. Here's what the wetlands area kind of looks like at low tide. It becomes pretty mucky, pretty wet, with the tall grasses on either side. And then finally, here's what it looks like at high tide as the water comes up and fills out Lemon Creek and kind of trickles out into the tall grasses. So we picked 15 locations along this creek, 3 by the mouth, maybe 6 downstream of the bridge, and 5 or 6 upstream of the bridge. And we decided that these are going to be the 15 different locations that we're going to try to grow oysters and see how well we do. Of course, the next thing we need is oysters. So here we decided to visit our friends at the Billion Oyster Project, who have their headquarters on Governor's Island, right in the middle of New York Harbor. And the process starts in these big bubbling tanks. They put a bunch of mature breeding age oysters into the bubbling tanks, which is just Hudson River water at this point. The breeding oysters release a bunch of tiny little oyster larvae, little baby oysters floating around in this water. And then the larvae stick onto used oyster shells. It's a process called spatting, S-P-A-T. And here's what it actually looks like. Uh, this is a used oyster shell, an empty half of an oyster, with there's maybe 10 or 15 of these little larvae that have spatted onto it. Um, they're about the size of a pea, each of these little spats, and they always end up sticking onto oyster shells. So side note, if you ever have oyster shells left over, if you're able to, get them back into the ocean or back near an oyster breeding ground because they will be made use of. Um, sorry. And then here's a close up of what these little oyster spats look like. At this point, we took all of our baby oysters, we put them into these big cages, and we dropped them into the Hudson River and let them sit for 2 months. Um, we came back several months later, we opened the cages back up, and we found that our baby oysters had become teenager oysters. They'd become juvenile oysters. And here's what these clumps actually look like up close. Um, you can see that all of the oysters are growing out from that one single shell. So this is, 10 or 15 juvenile oysters. Probably each one was the size of a quarter or maybe a little bigger, all stuck together into this irregular, jagged clump, which will become important as we'll see later. Also, I'll note that the newly forming edges of their shells are sharp. Be careful picking them up. They get quite sharp. Um, so we have these clumps of juvenile oysters. We attached tags to them uh, with zip ties so we could keep track of which one was which. And then it was time to get them down to Lemon Creek. So we built a little rig. Here's our experimental rig. This is what it looks like. It's pretty simple. It's a cage full of oysters with these two barrel floats on each side so it can go up and down with the tide, all attached to a cinder block for an anchor. Pretty simple. We built 15 of these, and then we went out to our 15 locations along Lemon Creek and tossed them into the water. There we go. As simple as that. Um, at that point, we left them. We let them go up and down, float up and down in the creek, do their oyster thing, and we came back several times over the course of that fall. I think it was maybe a 5-month period that they stayed in the water there, and we came back 4 times. And each time we came back, we pulled them out, and as you can imagine, on the coast of Staten Island, they got kind of mucky. They got a lot of algae and other stuff growing on them. We opened them up, we took our oysters out, and we measured them one by one with calipers to see how much each oyster had grown on average. How did they do? Here is, put simply, oh, sorry, yeah, this is the measuring process. Side note, this is also a great off-label use for kiddie pools, is to dump oysters into if you ever have an extra kiddie pool. Very good. Here's how we did. So this experiment took place between September of 2016 and December of 2016. And in the green, you can see that our oysters in the lagoon, that pond down by the mouth of the creek, did the best. They grew from about 2 centimeters to 6 centimeters on average. The oysters that were downstream by the mouth in red did the second best. And the oysters that were upstream in blue here did the third best. And I'm kind of proud to say that this is pretty good growth. This is about what you expect from natural oysters growing as they would in the wild. I mean, it suggests that the waters of Lemon Creek are indeed healthy enough to sustain natural oyster growth. So we were pretty excited to see that. But of course, we wanted to compare our results to others, and we weren't the only ones conducting these kinds of experiments. There are also oyster restoration experiments going on near the Brooklyn Bridge, at Governor's Island, um, in South Brooklyn at Bush Terminal, in Great Krills Harbor on Staten Island, and of course us at Lemon Creek right there. And here's where we end up. We're kind of right about in the middle, which, I'm proud of. So we were very pleased to see that oysters will indeed grow in Lemon Creek, Staten Island. And as you would expect, the ones that got the most water flow down by the lagoon and downstream where the tide is coming in and out grew the best. And the ones that got the least water flow upstream grew the not as best. I'm not going to say worst. Okay. Then the big question has to be why? Why are we doing oyster restoration? Why are we bothering? What's the point of all of this? Um, well, it is not to eat them, although they are delicious. And here's the proper method. You start with a little cocktail sauce and a little horseradish. I like a little more horseradish than regular cocktail sauce. And then you go up and all the way back, straight in. That's how you do it. But am I wearing the same shirt? Oh, that's almost embarrassing. Anyway, um, they're not for eating, although they are delicious. New York Harbor oysters are unfortunately still unsafe to eat. Um, and that's because New York Harbor has something called a combined sewer outflow. So the water, the wastewater and sewage that goes down your toilet and out of your house, and the water that goes into the storm drains in the streets, all goes into the same system. It's a combined sewer. Now, that's good because all that water should be treated before it goes back into the Hudson and into the East River and into the bay. It goes to plants like this one, a wastewater treatment facility, which you may recognize if you've ever been on the West Side Highway at about 145th Street. This one actually has a lovely little park above the wastewater treatment plant, which is nice, but just don't think about what's going on beneath you. So it's good. The problem is when we get a lot of rain, like on a day like today, um, the whole system gets overwhelmed and they have to dump the excess. So the storm water is being dumped, but so is the raw untreated sewage. And that's how we get scenes like this in the Gowanus Canal, which is one of the outlets for the combined sewer outflow on a rainy day. And it's not pleasant. Like as fast as this neighborhood is gentrifying, like it's still dealing with this. So New York Harbor oysters are still unsafe to eat. I don't recommend eating them, but that's not why we're working on these oyster restoration projects. There are actually three reasons why we are doing it, and they are all ecological and environmental. So reason number one, oysters actually clean water themselves. Oysters are in fact filter feeders. An adult oyster can filter about 50 gallons of water per day. So a lot of the cleanup that we hope to accomplish could be accomplished naturally by oysters. That's number one. They clean water. Two, oysters are a keystone species. So much like a beaver or coral reef, their growth and their life cycle provides habitat for other species. So oyster reefs like these provide homes for and habitats for fish, crabs, birds, amphibians, all different other kinds of animals live in the ecosystems that oysters create. So we want to restore some of that in New York Harbor. But perhaps the most important reason why we're interested in oyster restoration is the third one. And this is as New York City and other coastal cities become more vulnerable to rising waters and extreme weather, oysters might actually help us to protect the shorelines. It's oyster reefs, because of their irregular shapes, like that clump that I showed you, are actually really good at absorbing and dissipating wave energy. and they help hold the shorelines together, just like the grass in the dunes that you're not supposed to walk on at the beach is very important because it holds the dunes together. Oysters can do the same thing for shorelines. So we call this a nature-based solution, using nature's own tools to protect the things that we build from the threat of climate change. And, I'll point out that oysters as climate change mitigation is not some kind of fringe tree hugger idea only. It is also a main strategy of uh, both the federal and state government in places like New York City. So after Hurricane Sandy, New York State was looking to spend a bunch of money to protect the city from the next big storm, which I'm sure will be coming at some point. And one of the main things that they did was spend $60 million on something called the Living Breakwaters Project. And here's how this works. This is just a headline from their press release. It's already under construction. It's not done yet, but they've already done quite a bit of work. And it is basically like a dotted line of breakwaters that sit, maybe 100 yards out from the coast of southeastern Staten Island. So this is pretty much where Lemon Creek is, Princess Bay. And here's how these things are supposed to work. They build these barriers out of concrete and, rock and, stable, substantial things. The waves hit the breakwaters, and then on the lee side, on the shore side, in this area where the kayaks are paddling around, the idea is to seed oyster beds. And the oyster beds take that wave energy coming through and over the breakwaters and dissipate it. The jagged little oyster beds release and kind of absorb all of that energy and protect the shoreline, the part that we want to protect, from storm surges, erosion, extreme weather, and rising seas, the kinds of things that we're worried about going forward with the threat of climate change, not just in the future, but already here and planned to get worse. These projects are happening all around the world. So the kind of work that we did in Lemon Creek is also being done in Australia, New South Wales, in Hong Kong, in Senegal. All of these places are using oyster restoration as a nature-based solution to protect the shorelines from the perils of climate change. Even the idea of a living seawall is definitely not unique to New York. Here's a similar kind of project that they're working on in Sydney, in Australia. And I think they're hugely important if we are going to protect big coastal cities like New York, but also Miami or London or Lagos or Mumbai. If we're going to protect these cities, we are going to need big, expensive projects that are man-made, like sea gates and dams and dikes and walls, like they currently have in places in like Venice or Amsterdam. That's all important. We're going to need that. But we can also use the tools that nature provides in order to do some of the work and help us out in a cheaper, less disruptive, less invasive way, the way shorelines protected themselves before we built up these big cities that are now in the way of the wave energy, the rising waters, the extreme weather. So there you have it. The past, the present, and even a possible future for oysters in New York Harbor. And with that, I'll thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that might have come up in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I'm glad you left it on a positive note there.
Right.
It's really great to see this story, this, history coming together with modern solutions, even if it was the city that caused the problem. So I invite people to ask any questions in the chat, and I can go ahead and ask those. While we're waiting for people to put questions in the chat, I do have some starter questions. So environmental history is a really cool subject. And I was just wondering, to start, are there any like favorite sources or archives and libraries that you enjoy looking at when you're doing this type of research?
The historian's ultimate question, right? What are the sources? I love it.
Hmm.
Um, I've actually been overwhelmed by the availability of sources in and about New York. I mean, I spent most of my time working on New York City, but I'm also interested in environmental history globally, especially of cities. And I was lucky enough before I started at Wagner to do a postdoc at a place called the Museum of the City of New York. Um, so almost all of these maps and photographs are from there. I mean, I worked on exhibits that told stories about oysters, and I trolled through our own collections, and then the other usual suspects of the places that you might look, like the New York Historical Society, the New York Public Library, the city archives, and like it wasn't hard to find because it was and has been such a big deal in New York City history. Like everyone was talking about, everyone was eating, everyone was making money off oysters. So there are plenty of resources from the imagery to the maps to written discussions. Um, and if you're particularly interested in the subject of oysters, I'd recommend a book called The Big Oyster by a historian named Mark Kurlansky, Kurlansky, Mark Kurlansky. Um, and he does these fascinating environmental studies of commodities. He wrote a book called Cod about cod nationwide as a resource and or worldwide. And yeah, he's got a great collection of recipes, maps, documents, letters, every kind of source that you might imagine to help us understand, what seems like kind of a narrow field, history of oysters, actually was kind of all over the city all the time.
Okay. We have one quest, someone asking if, do you know anything about oysters being found in the Mid-Hudson Valley or Poughkeepsie area?
I don't, but I'm very curious. I'm looking in my notes and I forgot to mention when I was showing the image of the meadowlands, the wetlands and the meadowlands in New Jersey, I was back up in Red Hook a couple weeks ago and took a walk around Tivoli Bays and I thought, this kind of looks like Tivoli Bays. This looks like around Kruger Island. Um, and I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe there are oysters have been found that far. My understanding is that the salt really only comes up as far as around Newburgh or Beacon. That's where the high tide salt mark is, I guess. So I would be surprised if oysters made it much further past the brackish water. But who knows?
Yeah, we'll have to ask some local people up here to see if they have any information on that. We have a question about, do you know anything about plans to change the wastewater treatment in the city? This is also a two-pronged question. They want to know if you still agree that you are one of the best goalies in Red Hook soccer history.
Got to be Mr. Sutton, right?
Yes.
Without a doubt. I mean, all due respect to Tim Provisi, but no, I made a lot of saves. I hope I can't do it anymore for sure. Um, So this, yes, I mean, we would love to change the sewer system in the city. The problem is it is tremendously, probably prohibitively expensive. I mean, the sewers are the lowest thing. They put the clean water pipes, the electricity pipes, everything above the level of the sewer pipes because I mean, for obvious reasons, they don't want anything. They wouldn't want the sewer water to trickle down into that other stuff. So like to get to and access all of that sewer across 5 boroughs is tremendously expensive and tremendously disruptive. However, one of the workarounds potentially that is being worked on, it's also expensive, but it's less expensive, is to create essentially holding ponds. I mean, they're not ponds, like holding tanks, giant storage. So when the rain is falling heavily and when the system is under pressure, they can divert some of that wastewater into these storage tanks and containers and areas. They're almost like reservoirs. They're not really tanks. They have to be enormous. And then once the rain dies down and the system can then handle more, is to then kind of let it out bit by bit into the system without overwhelming it. So that's going on. Gowanus, they're doing that to try to avoid the Gowanus because it's become really public. I know that's like the place that people go to complain about the sewer is the Gowanus Canal. Um, but all around the city, they're building these holding tanks when they can. But it feels like an almost unsolvable problem because it's just so big and expensive. What was part two? Oh, part two was about a goalie. Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
definite
We
yes
have a
on the goal.
yeah. We have a question here about what is the lifespan of an oyster?
Any biologists out there? Here's what so I worked with a lot. I am a historian, but I worked with a lot of biologists on this project, and it's longer than you think. Um, so the oyster that you get on your plate, the vast majority of the time is farmed, and Pacific Northwest, still on Long Island. These are the places where they're doing big oyster farming. And I think those oysters that would be about, you know, yay big, single bite, probably 2, 3 years old, something like that. But they can live much longer. I vaguely recall that that oyster that I showed you, the really, really big shell that was almost a foot long, I think they can count rings, like they count tree rings in the shell. And that one, I think they said was something like 60 years old. So they
Yeah.
will keep growing if the conditions are right. But, we harvest them much before that point.
Yeah. Okay. And I had another question for you is generally, having now taught environmental history in New York, are there other topics that you think that you've been interested in exploring outside of oysters or like in terms of environmental history and New York?
Absolutely. My new favorite topic to discuss because it's so current, is so environmental history is learning about things that are in the environment, like animals and plants, but it's also thinking about policies, thinking about choices that we make that affect how the city operates and the impact that we have on the environment. Um, so probably a lot of people have heard about this, but New York City is in the very midst of the process of trying to decide how to implement congestion pricing, which would be a toll essentially on cars, private cars and trucks, to drive in Manhattan, to use the streets south of 60th Street. And the goal here is to um, reduce congestion, reduce emissions, and make the city more livable, and then take the money that it produces and put that into public transportation to give people an alternative to using cars. Basically, kind of a stick to force people out of cars and onto public transportation, which is environmentally friendly. And some argue makes the city more livable. Um, so this is the kind of topic that I love to have my students debate. So I assign them roles. Some of them are drivers, some of them are city residents, some of them are public transportation workers, and we have 2 or 3 days of class where we just argue about how to do this, much like real New York City is arguing about how to do this right now. So yeah, it's been, carbon taxes. Is that a way to address climate change? How do we deal with wastewater? How do we get food? How do we get drinking water? Um, how do we use space in the highest possible ways? All of these are the kinds of things that I love to debate when talking about environmental history, which of course is not entirely history. It's also environmental present, and future, because the students who are debating this in our classes are also the people who are voting for the politicians who are debating this in real life.
Yeah, so I've personally written down The Big Oyster as a book I'm going to be looking up. Do you have any at last like book recommendations for those of us who are interested in this subject or
Yeah,
environmental history broadly?
environmental history. One of my favorites is called Taming Manhattan.
Yeah.
Taming Manhattan. The author is someone who teaches at Portland State in Oregon, I think. And it's It's all 19th century, and it's a fascinating look at how the city dealt with the problems of then, which are a lot similar to the problems of today, like how to use park space or whether to have parks and how to organize it, how to deal with trash, how to dispose of garbage, and the big one, how to deal with I guess, the emissions of the day from the transportation, which was horse manure everywhere. Like it was a huge thing that everyone in the city was arguing about. What are we going to do in a city where, all of the power is provided by hundreds of thousands of horses who are, you know, doing what horses do in the streets. So it's a really fascinating book. That book is called Taming Manhattan, Catherine something.
Okay. It reminds me of another book I read. I think it was called Animal City, and it talks about 19th century New York City and animal power. It gets to that
Mhm.
same issue.
Catherine
Um,
McNor is the author. Taming Manhattan
oh,
by
great,
Catherine McNor.
great,
MC Nor, Neur.
great. So I'm seeing a lot of just general thanks in the chat for coming for the presentation. Someone has asked, and it is recorded. This is going to be available on our website. So that will be easily accessible within a week or so. I just want to thank you again for doing this presentation. It was fascinating. And thank you everyone who came out tonight to tune in. So that's it for us tonight.